that recording in progress. So yes, this presentation comes from my larger book project that Thaddeus mentioned in the generous introduction. The book is also provisionally titled The Revolt of Things, and it looks at the relationship between some of the most formally striking works of literature in late imperial and especially early Soviet Russia, on the one hand, and on the other hand, it looks at the momentous shifts in material culture and in the status and availability of everyday objects that took place in Russia during the first several decades of the 20th century. So writers I study in other parts of the project that I'm not going to be talking about today include Marietta Shiginian as an author of Krasnye Pinkertony, of popular crime and adventure novels with a pro-Soviet bent, Fyodor Gladkov as the pioneer with Tsiment of the genre of the production novel that would later become the foundation of socialist realism, and Yuri Alyosha, whose ambiguous and highly metaphorical and imagistic prose encodes an unorthodox view, I think, of the paradoxes of Soviet commodity culture. But today, my focus is on Vladimir Khlyebnikov and Vladimir Mayakovsky, the luminaries of the futurist avant-garde who originated the phrase that I'm shamelessly stealing for my title, namely Восстание вещей. So to talk about Russian futurists and their close relatives in terms of Vichism is not, of course, new. Scholars who focus mainly on movements and manifestos have written a great deal about the ideological and aesthetic aims surrounding left art movements of the 1920s, from constructivism to factography and beyond, focusing particularly on figures like Boris Arbatov and institutions such as Lev and Novy Lev, all of which were variously committed to applying artistic methods in the service of the post-revolutionary transformation of byt. As for the earlier pre-revolutionary glory days of futurism, we are accustomed to seeing the poetics, especially of the Cubo-futurists, as marked by an orientation towards materiality. And by the way, can everyone see the new slide? Fantastic. All right. So, for example, writing about Mayakovsky, Mikhail Gasparov says the following: Отношение Маяковского к предмету — это установка на вещественность, материальность, конкретность изображаемого мира. And a contemporary of Mayakovsky's, the populist critic Razumnik Ivanov-Razumnik, made a related observation in more negative terms. He objected to Mayakovsky's poetic lexicon, which he called Veshny, Мясистый, Крикливый, and also to his rhymes. Ivanov-Razumnik describes the poet as working над тяжелыми, долготущими, искусственными, подлинно-машинными, вечными рифмами. So even besides Mayakovsky's well-known fondness for phonetic dissonance, the Cubo-futurists' orientation to the poetic word, taken more generally, can be understood as a desire to free the word from its conventional mimetic or referential ties to an object in order to transform the word into a freestanding and self-sufficient thing in its own right. And this, I think, is the goal of Khlyebnikov and Kruchonik's famous slogans like Slovo как таковое, самовитое слово, самоценное слово, и так далее. So one of the main paths pursued by the futurists to materialize the word in this way was to emphasize the physical properties of the linguistic sign, both acoustically with the phoneme as something spoken and heard, and visually through the manipulation of typefaces, letters, and line breaks on the page or on posters. In other words, sound and visual appearance as aspects of the word would liberate themselves from mere semantics. And this, as we know, is the spirit that gave rise to early futurist works, such as Khlyebnikov's creation of an entire poem out of words newly derived from the root smях in Zaklятие смехом, Kruchonik's Zaum experiment Dir Bulshil, and others, and Mayakovsky's cubist mirroring of syllables and splitting of words across line breaks in poems like Iz ulici v ulicu. So I've briefly summarized these commonly held positions in the scholarly literature on futurism in order to distinguish and contrast my own interests, which approach the question of futurism and things in a different way. Not that I disagree with the conclusions stated previously, which I don't, but I think that there is another side to the question that needs to be illuminated. If we take the futurists' manifestos too much at their word, no pun intended, about the separation of Samavitya Slava from their conventional reference, and this was, in the first place, a kind of polemical claim meant to attack both the mimetic representational art of realism and the hazy metaphysical speculation of symbolism. If we do this, then I think we run the risk of misreading the futurists' poetry. Futurism did not, I claim, detach poetic verbal innovation from the material world, from the familiar world of material objects. Rather, futurist poetry reaches toward the material world while denying mere mimetic reflection, searching instead to reconfigure reality according to a new set of principles or laws. And we can learn something by returning to the problem of вещи in futurist poetry and considering this problem in relation to the tangible and immense changes in Russia's economic and social life and the fabric of everyday material culture that characterized the times in which they wrote. To put it another way, we already know a great deal about the futurists' materialization of the sign, about their treatment of words as having independent physical being. And now, I propose, we should turn our attention toward futurism's semioticization of the thing, allowing manufactured objects to acquire the dynamism and intentionality of words. So on this basis, in this talk, I'd like to trace the trope of the revolt of things, or восстание вещей, through several texts by Khlebnikov and Mayakovsky written over a period from 1909 to the early 1920s. The basic theme of the восстание вещей, what more or less all of these texts have in common, is a depiction of inanimate everyday objects that come to life and, motivated by a will of their own, rise up to overturn the human social and semiotic order within which they previously existed. Khlebnikov first coined the phrase восстание вещей in his long 1909 poem Żurawie, where the rebellion of things is clearly dystopian and even apocalyptic. Mayakovsky then adopted the trope and articulated it differently throughout many texts in the 1910s and 20s, generally with a much more positive valence. Mayakovsky was prone to treating the восстание вещей as a sympathetic rebellion against Philistine bourgeois values, and even as a model for futurist poetics. So you can see a short list of important works that relate to the восстание вещей trope here, and of course I won't have time to talk about them all, and I won't attempt to do so, so don't panic. I'll have to be somewhat selective today, but please feel free to bring up any of these texts or any others that are not even on here in the discussion after the talk, and it would be a pleasure to go into more detail. I do, since this is sort of a timeline, right, in addition to being a kind of bibliography, and I do want to emphasize just how many seismic shifts in Russia's economy and industrial base, and therefore in the production and circulation of manufactured things and commodities, took place within this period of roughly 15 years. Though Tsarist Russia's economic backwardness compared to Western Europe was and is almost a cliche, the situation had begun to change dramatically in the 1890s when an industrial boom began that was partly facilitated by the policies of Minister of Finance Sergei Witta, who courted foreign capital investment and greatly subsidized the development of the rail system and other key infrastructure. The effects of accelerated industrialization were disproportionately felt, of course, in urban centers. So this is when cities like Moscow and Petersburg come to attract more and more factories, as well as the goods these factories produced. While the start of the First World War did little to deter industrial production, which in many sectors continued to grow after 1914, even as necessary goods became difficult or impossible to afford for most of the empire's citizens, the short-term consequences of the revolutions of 1917 were a period of sharp decline. The Civil War was economically devastating, causing factories and infrastructure to be ruined and leading to punishing shortages of basic necessities, both in the cities and in the countryside. Only with the introduction of the new economic policy, NEP, by Lenin in the early 1920s, did substantial industrial recovery occur, but with the curious side effect, as we all know, of a new mixed economy, with a conflicted Bolshevik regime seeking to stimulate private enterprise and greater consumption under communist political leadership. This turbulent environment of rapid-fire industrialization, deindustrialization, and shifts from private enterprise to state control to a mixture of the two is necessary context for the futurists' poetic engagement with both вещи and the disruptive transformation of everyday life. So for the early Khlebnikov, writing Żurawie in 1909, the consequences of Tsarist industrialization were sinister and required novel poetic means to properly describe. So here, at last, I'll turn to the poetry. So Żurawie opens by placing us within a city that is clearly St. Petersburg, with a reference to the golden spire of the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral that houses the tombs of dead Tsars. But this classical landmark of the cityscape is soon replaced by a more modern and unnerving one. So to just read the opening. На площади влагу входящего угла, где златом сияющая игла покрыла кладбище царей, Там мальчик в ужасе шептал: «Ей-ей, смотри, закачались в хмелье трубы, те!» Приняли в ужасе заики губы, и взор прикован к высоте. Что, мальчик бредит наяву? Я мальчика зову. Но он молчит и вдруг бежит. Какие страшные скачки! Я медленно достаю очки. So to pause here. Having drawn our attention to the ominous movement of the smokestacks, this terrified young boy runs away, never to be seen again for the rest of the poem. Not only that, the lyric subject also seems to disappear after putting on his glasses. Not that he literally disappears, but that any trace of a lyrical first-person voice vanishes completely from the poema after these opening lines. The pronoun ya is never seen again except in quoted speech, and the rest of the poem unfolds in the third person. So over nearly 200 lines of rhyming free verse, and this is obviously enough lines that I can only show you extracts on the PowerPoint rather than the whole thing, unfortunately. Khlyebnikov describes how a huge and monstrous artificial bird is formed by mysteriously mobile parts of the cityscape, all of which are usually inanimate, but now mysteriously animated. This process begins with the swaying smokestacks and continues with a large iron hook which gallops along the Neva. Resembling the bones of a hand or a claw, it beckons other objects to join it. Но что же, скачет до реки в каком-то вихре железный кисти руки подобный крюк. Стоя над волнами, когда они стихли, он походил на подарок, на память костяку рук. Час к части он стремится к вещам с неведомой еще силой, так узник на свидание стремится навстречу милой. And with the uznik there, we have our first reference to the previously subjugated or figuratively imprisoned nature of the things. So, the Vyeshi respond to this summons, and the formation of the crane is described in remarkably precise anatomical detail. Iron buildings serve as the bird's legs. Train cars bearing their functional inscriptions, like для некурящих, для служилых, and railroad and tram tracks weave around each other to serve as veins, binding together the crane's skeleton. The Tuchkov Bridge, which earlier unmoored itself to float along the river, serves as a breastbone, a grudina. The factory's manifold chimneys, their многочисленные трубы, which have been flying around in the air ever since the frightened boy first noticed them, finally come together to create the crane's long neck. From here, things take a turn for the gruesome. The crane's iron skeleton acquires its flesh from human corpses, which raise themselves from the grave to join the creature of their own accord. So, какая-то птица, шагая по небу ногами могильного холма, с восьмиконечными крестами, раскрыла далекий клюв, и половниками его замкнула свет, и в свете том яснеют толпы мертвецов в союз спешащие вступить с вещами. Могучий созидался остров. The crane, now fully materialized, menaces the residents of Petersburg in a scene that recalls both the apocalypse and political revolution. Свершился переворот, жизнь уступила власть союзу трупа и вещи. In passing the word переворот here, we should recall that the poem was written only a few years after the attempted revolution of 1905. However, while 1905 notoriously ended without a meaningful change of regime, the sinister crane's industrial coup is far more successful at forcing life itself to surrender power, to уступить власть. The crane dances grotesquely in the second half of the poem and devours living human children, children whom it demands as a kind of tribute or sacrifice, while the helpless Petersburgers draw lots to select which of their children to give away. Finally, in the last two lines, and with no apparent motivation, the bird itself flies away. Но однажды он поднялся и улетел вдаль, больше его не видали. And incidentally, the most convincing explanation that I've found for this kind of abrupt ending comes from Vladimir Markov, who says that it's because Khlyebnikov was finishing the poem sometime after he started it, and so he just simply lost interest and found that the most straightforward way he could end it was simply to end it in those brief couple of lines. And so, you know, if this is true and I haven't found a better explanation, then I'm not going to make very much of this rather sudden conclusion to the poem in my interpretation. So, readers often note that neither the thematics nor the style of Juravi bear much resemblance to Khlyebnikov's later work, making this an eccentric poem even within the corpus of this famously eccentric poet. So what do we make of it? Writing in 1921, Roman Jakobson identified the poema's key device as realization of metaphors. For Jakobson, the swaying of the smokestacks at the beginning is a figurative description of the delirious mental state of the young boy, which then takes the form of a real phenomenon that serves as the basis for the following narrative. Jakobson calls it a проекция литературного приема в художественную реальность, превращение поэтического тропа в поэтический факт, сюжетное построение. Certainly, the realization of metaphors and similes in this way is widespread in futurist poetry. We might recall the moment in Mayakovsky's Облако в штанах when the poet's heart, burning with unrequited love, becomes a literal and deadly conflagration requiring the attention of the fire department. And indeed, this device of realizing a metaphor could itself be seen as a formal reflection of the Восстание вещей, taking the supposedly incidental outer shell of a figure of speech and corporealizing it so that it becomes physically real. That said, in my view, Jakobson's early formalist insistence on the absolute self-sufficiency of the literary device leads him somewhat astray when he tries to describe the motivirovka of this trope in terms of the delirious pathology of the scared young boy at the start. This boy exits the poem after just 10 lines, and so his possible delirium seems a rather flimsy justification for the elaborate grand guignol that follows. More significant and more consistent with Chernykhov's theme is the fact that the narrator only sees the chimney's sway and only presents this event to the reader as real by putting on his glasses. Я медленно достаю очки. He entrusts his and our vision to a manufactured thing. Indeed, this is the exact moment at which the first-person narrator disappears altogether, and the ya disappears along with him, except in quoted speech, none of which belongs to the lyric narrators. Thus, by supplanting his bare vision with that of the glasses, the narrator ensures that his own human subjectivity, his ya, is displaced by a thing, inviting the poetic materialization of the Восстание вещей against mere humanity. The figure of the narrator in front of the Peter and Paul Cathedral points to an important literary inheritance of Żurawi. The poema clearly participates in the tradition that Vladimir Toporov dubbed the Peterburgsky text, a tradition that began, of course, with Pushkin's Medny Всадник and continued through Gogol and Dostoevsky and into the Silver Age. In particular, Chernykhov's scenario recalls Medny Всадник in its fantastic violation of physical reality, its eschatological mood, and its depiction of the cityscape thrown into elemental chaos by the fruits of modernization. So we could here note the specific elements also in the lines, Изжилес и меди над городом восстал грозя костяк. The med there is, not coincidental. Meanwhile, the verb восстать, meaning rise up, of course, carries the figurative meaning of a social or political uprising, as we know, as in Восстание вещей, but it could also be read as recalling the threatening stance of the equestrian statue of Peter the Great, with his horse riding up on its hind legs, that gives Pushkin's poem its name. Yet there's a crucial way in which Chernykov transforms the paradigm of Medny Всадник and other prior Petersburg texts. In the Petersburg tradition, forces of nature, like storms and the flooding Neva, form an unlikely and ineffable alliance with their antithesis, the force of human artifice, rationality, and political power. Thus, in Pushkin, the raging river and the vengeful statue of the Всадник each play a role in driving the poor clerk Yevgeny to his death, and so on and so on. Both nature and culture, both the Neva and the bronze horseman, are turned from inanimate substances into willful and active agents. There is an exchange of attributes between living and non-living beings, whether those beings are natural or social. This aspect of the Petersburg text is understood by Toporov in metaphysical and apocalyptic terms as the invasion of the earthly world by the infernal realm. Now, Chernykov preserves this exchange of attributes between the living and the non-living, but with a novel twist. The mysteriously animate agents of destruction in his version of Petersburg are the cityscape's manifold objects. Most of them, like the smokestacks and the railway cars, are products of the industrial boom initiated by Witte. Nor does Chernykov forget about nature. Rather than presenting a binary antithesis between natural and anthropogenic forces, he collapses the two terms into one, depicting the industrial monster in his poem through constant reference to the natural and animal world. And this starts, of course, with the title, Żurawi. And while the monster does indeed take the form of a grotesque giant bird, the word Żurawi carries the same double meaning as the English crane or French grue, referring to both a bird and a piece of industrial equipment. And the more common word for the equipment is Kran, right, borrowed from German. But a volume of the Brockhaus-Ephron Encyclopedic Dictionary from 1895 gives żurawie as a synonym for Kran Padjomny. And the lexically hypersensitive Chlebnikov was certainly aware of this valence of the word. Indeed, the Brockhaus-Ephron article clarifies that the equipment was called Kran because of its resemblance to the avian crane, which is Kranich in German. And speaking of autonomous things, the light in my office mysteriously turns off sometimes. Okay, it's back on. Wonderful. So the swaying smokestacks at the start of the poem are likened to выпьи, a bird related to herons on a swamp. Так делаются подвижными, татоли неподвижнее на болоте выпьи. They're also compared to worms and cats. Трубы, стоявшие века, летят, движением подражают червяка, игривее в шалости котя. The mechanical bird is described in precise and seemingly organic anatomical detail, from its skeleton to its veins and flesh. And Chlebnikov gets very precise indeed, including such avian specificities as the crane's furcula or wishbone, its dushka, forged from a watchtower and its ceremonial cannon. The crane's backbone, its stanovoy chrybiet, is fused together from beetle-like streetcars, żukoobrazные повозки. Moreover, humanity's helplessness before the crane is described with reference to the pagan, the pantheistic and naturally rooted monsters of Russian folklore. Злей не будьте кращей, чем будет, может быть, восстание вещей. Against this formidable fusion of the natural and the industrial, humanity stands helpless. And this brings me to one of Chlebnikov's most striking departures from the traditional tropes of the Petersburg text. Prior works in the Petersburg tradition tend to foreground an individual human protagonist who struggles to maintain coherence amidst the infernal powers of the city. And these protagonists range from Pushkin's Yevgeny to Gogol's poor clerks and deluded officers, Dostoevsky's tormented anti-heroes, and closer to Chlebnikov's day, even Alexander Blok's putatively autobiographical lyric subject. This human protagonist may be thoroughly beleaguered in their battle with Petersburg, but they do remain the focus of the narrative. But for Chlebnikov, the central character is not a person at all. Rather, it's the monstrous crane. After the departure of the boy and the narrator at the start of the poem, humanity is almost always referenced in only the most abstract and collective terms, underlining human powerlessness before the mechanical bird. The poem's apostrophes bewail humanity's witless, tragic creations of the very things which now malevolently rise up to devour it. «О род людской, ты был как мякоть, в которой созрели иные семена. Зачем же вещи мы балуем?» Now, all of these laments reinforce the passivity of humanity before its own industrial creations. And I'll quote a lengthier example. «Свершился переворот, жизнь уступила власть союзу трупа и вещи. О, человек, какой коварный дух, тебе шептал убийца и советник сразу. Дух жизни, вещи евреи, ты расплескал безумно разум, и вот ты снова данник журавлей». Chlebnikov's poem seems to suggest that by the early 20th century, the world of mass-produced things that industrialization has wrought is so totalizing and anonymous in its power as to entirely overwhelm humanity. And here I'll borrow another phrase from Ivanov Razumnik, who in his criticism of Mayakovsky's work referred to the saddling of futurism by its obsession with things. He called the movement «осёдланной вещью», and he ironically described this unfortunate state as the karma капиталистического развития. Журавль, I think, is all about the karma капиталистического развития, and far from being saddled by naive trust in the forces of capitalist development, Chlebnikov offers a penetrating critique of them. Rather than confronting a human subject with a demiurgic opponent, as in Pushkin and his successors, Журавль presents industrial modernity as paralyzing living humanity altogether. In fact, if we return to the way that the scene is set, the way that Chlebnikov places the poem within St. Petersburg, by obliquely referring to the Peter and Paul Cathedral as the Kladbyshe Tsarye, we might read it as burying Tsar Peter himself, who was once the sinister antagonist of the Petersburg myth, and transferring his role to the newer and more depersonalized regime of domination entailed by capitalist modernization. The paralyzing fusion of nature and culture found in Juravi can, I think, be further specified by borrowing from a somewhat surprising source, namely Georg Lukács's book, The Theory of the Novel. Now, I realize that Lukács may seem to be an unlikely point of reference in this discussion for several reasons. One of them is Lukács's famous antipathy in his kind of mature career towards any kind of modernism in art. And there's also the obvious fact that Juravi is not a novel. To be clear, I don't claim any direct connection between Lukács and Chlebnikov. I frankly doubt that either of them ever read the other. And more importantly, the theory of the novel was written several years after Juravi, in any case. So I'm not making any claim to direct influence in either direction. But to address the genre question, it is notable that Lukács's conception of the novel does bear some resemblance to Chlebnikov's work in Juravi and elsewhere. What I think they have in common is that is an attempt to resuscitate and revive the form of the ancient epic under specifically modern conditions. Moreover, Lukács, who at this stage was not yet a Marxist, is still motivated by a neo-romantic anti-capitalism that helps illustrate Chlebnikov's own. The theory of the novel articulates many of the concepts I see at work in Juravi, the objectification of human activity as external forces, seemingly intractable, imprisoning humanity from without. And Lukács's term for this phenomenon is second nature. So in a passage that resonates with Chlebnikov's lines from Juravi about mankind spilling its intellect around and pouring the spirit of life into things, life surrendering its power to the union of corpse and thing, and so on, Lukács writes, "Second nature, the nature of man-made structures, is not dumb, sensuous, and yet senseless like the first. It is a complex of senses, meanings, which has become rigid and strange, and which no longer awakens interiority. It is a charnel house of long-dead interiorities. When the sole content of these constructs can no longer directly become soul, when the constructs no longer appear as the agglomerate and concentrate of interiorities which can at any moment be transformed back into a soul, then they must, in order to subsist, achieve a power which dominates men blindly, without exception or choice. And so men call law the recognition of the power that holds them in thrall, and they conceptualize as law their despair at its omnipotence and universality, conceptualize it into a sublime and exalting logic, a necessity that is eternal, immutable, beyond reach." Lukács is a writer who I think was really not made to be read aloud, but we do what we must. For Lukács, then, second nature is when the products of human activity, both physical and mental, appear to us as if they were totally divorced from us, dominating us and subjecting us to their logic. And Lukács calls these social forces second nature because we experience them as inexorable and outside of our control, just as once humanity experienced the natural world. So if I may borrow from Lukács and put my claim in anachronistic terms, the originality of Juravi within the Petersburg tradition comes from how Chlebnikov adapts the Petersburg text to produce a realization, a materialization of the metaphor of second nature in response to the city's rapid recent economic development. The ultimate effect of Chlebnikov's realized similes is to render the monstrous crane as simultaneously industrial and pseudo-natural. The poem regards the crane as embodying not diabolical irrationality or elemental chaos, but an immutable and near-timeless plan of its own, similar to what Lukács calls law. And so to quote from Chlebnikov once again, lines which I think are not on the slides, which is an oversight, but «Вещи, выполняя какой-то давнишний замысел, следуя старинным предначертаниям». Moreover, Chlebnikov's imagery gives Lukács's charnel house of long-dead interiorities a more corporeal and gruesome twist. The crane is formed not only from pieces of the city's infrastructure, but also from dead human bodies which rise from their graves to give it flesh. And these corpses reference another unit of the Petersburg myth, of course, that the city is built upon the bodies of thousands of serfs who were conscripted by Peter to build his new capital upon a swamp and died in the process. So the bodies of human beings who lost their lives constructing the city join with the products of their labor, pieces of Petersburg's infrastructure, to form a tyrannical construct that dominates humankind. A crane made by human hands and in part from human flesh that appears as an implacable part of non-human nature. It should be noted also that as a piece of construction equipment, the animate crane is a thing that is capable of building, constructing, producing other things. In other words, able to reproduce itself without human intervention. So rather than a samavitaya slova, we could call the crane a kind of samavitaya viesh. Chlebnikov's version of second nature makes a mockery of any hopes for the reconciliation of nature and culture and depicts the fusion of the two terms as a soyuz trupa и вещи, which stands mortally opposed to the interests of living humanity, the sharpest version imaginable of the subject-object divide. Not until Mayakovsky's rewritings of the Восстание вещей will the power of rebellious things come into the orbit of human desires. With Mayakovsky, the futurist Восстание вещей makes a significant change in its orientation. The early Mayakovsky views mass-produced capitalist things not as a force of human subjugation, but as hopeful allies in the poet's own subjective and bohemian revolt against urban alienation. And this is where my focus shifts largely away from Chlebnikov and toward Mayakovsky, so consider this the kind of start of part two. So, Vladimir Mayakovsky Tragedia was both the young Mayakovsky's first major artistic succès de scandale and his first engagement with and rewriting of Chlebnikov's motif of the Восстание вещей. Indeed, Восстание вещей was actually one of Mayakovsky's initial working titles for the play. As you probably all know, the Tragedia is an extended lyric performance, with Mayakovsky playing himself at the center. Other characters, most of whom are named only with reference to a single distorted physical feature, serve as a kind of chorus, refracting the poet's own outsized presence. Insofar as the play has a plot, the first of its two acts is dominated by references to a looming Восстание вещей, a rebellion whose discursive and poetic character is accentuated by the fact that it is only described verbally rather than shown on stage. Set like Żurawli in a city which could only have been St. Petersburg, especially because it was in St. Petersburg's Luna Park that the famous premiere of the tragedy took place, the first act alludes quite explicitly to Chlebnikov's scenario when an old man with cats, человек с кошками, proclaims with alarm, «Зверя городов нареклись господами и лезут стереть нас бездушные вещи». So in Żurawli, the first sign of the thing's revolt was swaying smokestacks, трубы. In Mayakovsky's Tragedia, a man without an ear, человек без уха, recounts how «Я ходил, поддергиваясь, руки растопыря, а везде по крышам танцевали трубы, и каждая коленями выкидывая 44. This can already marks Mayakovsky's Восстание as more playful, though in its own way no less serious, than Chlebnikov's. Taking the man without an ear's story as confirmation of his grim prophecy, the old man with cats doubles down. Вот видите, вещи надо рубить, недаром в их ласках провидел врагая. The old man here gives an implicit interpretation of Żurawli, reading Chlebnikov's moral as the need to destroy things, lest things destroy us. However, this dire warning is contradicted by another character, a man with a drawn-out face, человек с растянутым лицом. А может быть, вещи надо любить. Может быть, у вещей душа другая. This anti-Chlebnikovian position is reinforced by the man without an ear, who says, многие вещи шиты наоборот, сердце не сердится, к злобе глухо. When the character named after Mayakovsky himself finally enters the debate, he exhorts the crowd, злоба не мажьте сердец концы. So not only does Mayakovsky reject the old man's violent hostility toward things, he actually commands us to be more like the things who the man without an ear described as deaf to wrath, right? К злобе глухо. So the full implications of this shift in attitude, of Mayakovsky's call to sympathize with and even love things, become clear only at the end of the tragedy's first act, when a man with one eye and one leg, человек без глаза и ноги, whom the stage direction is called joyous, радостный, bursts upon the scene and reports on the revolt of things, a revolt which again the audience does not actually witness. And so he does this in an ecstatic kind of lyric monologue. И вдруг все вещи кинулись, раздирая голос, скидывать с лохмотья изношенных имен. Винные витрины, как по пальцу сатаны, сами плеснули в нище фляжек. У обмершего портного сбежали штаны и пошли одни без человечьих ляжек. Пьяны, разинув черную пасть, вывалился из спальни комод. Корсеты слезали, боясь упасть, из вывесок роб. Unlike the bits and pieces of Khlyabnikov's crane, the things here are individualized in their movement, and each behaves in a manner that befits their identity. So the wine shop windows splash, the trousers walk, the louche bedroom commode stumbles drunkenly, the ladylike corsets daintily descend for fear of falling. They do, however, share an important feature in common, which sets them apart from Khlyabnikov's rebellious things, which is that all of Mayakovsky's things here are commercial products. The movement from Khlyabnikov's to Mayakovsky's versions of the Восстание вещей entails a shift in the socio-economic frame of reference from the modernization of infrastructure, like smokestacks, railroads, and lamps, to consumer commodities, merchandise that can be bought and sold in shops. Moreover, unlike the crane, the goal of these products' revolt is made to be explicitly semiotic. Not only do Mayakovsky's things rise up, they rip their voices and cast off the tatters of their worn-out names. For the corsets, this rebellion against their name takes a literal form marked by their descent from the physical signs, the wywieski, of the shops that sell them. When read in tandem with other early work by Mayakovsky, the corset's trepidation to descend from their wywieski seems to carry a double meaning, pointing to the poet's fascination and even infatuation with these street signs as semiotic bearers of urban modernity. So in the same year as the Tragedia in 1913, Mayakovsky wrote a short lyric poem, much less famous and less widely read than the Tragedia, called Wywieska. And this one, fortunately, is short enough that I actually can share it with you in its entirety. So, читайте железные книги, портрету золоченой буквы полезут копченые сики и золотокудрые брюквы. А если веселостью пёсей закружат созвездия маги, бюро похоронных процессий свои проведут саркофаги. Когда же, хмурый плачевен, загасит фонарные знаки, влюбляйтесь под небом харчевин, фаянсовых чайников маки. Contrary to the tone of Mayakovsky's other urban poems, including the Tragedia, there are very few traces of alienation, frustration, or contempt to be found here. Although one or two somber notes are struck, the poem's affect is generally excited, even jubilant. Moreover, Wywieska is noteworthy for its emphasis on the visual. We can discern the physical and visual appearance of telegraphic pictorial street signs as found outside shops in the first stanza. The second line's flieta resembles the tapered horizontal rod from which the sign hangs. And of course, padflietu could also be read as referring to actual flute music, but here I think the visual dimension trumps the acoustic. So the reference to the signs, excuse me, to the signs zalochena bukva can be taken not as mere rhetorical aggrandizement, but quite literally, since signboards often did employ gilded letters in order to exploit the high reflectivity of gold leaf and lend a sense of elegance to an otherwise utilitarian object, much as this poem in its entirety artfully combines both crude and precious elements. So under the flute, we have whitefish, sigi, and turnips, brukfru, which are presumably both descriptive images and also icons of products that are actually being sold. Their peculiar animacy, when they crawl paljezup under the golden flute-like rod, preserves the movement of objects that defines the Восстание вещей, but harnesses this energy toward benign and even aspirationally beautiful ends. If we recall Khlyabnikov for a moment, we remember that Juravu plays with the equivalence between the two terms of the natural world on one hand and the products of a modernizing economy on the other hand. Mayakovsky's turnips and fish collapse these two terms into one, since they are both organic beings and simultaneously commercial merchandise. The poem's most ecstatic movement, though, comes not from the crawling fish and turnips, but in the second stanza, the созвездия маги, which begin to whirl with a dog-like joy. This image is an index of the influx of foreign capital into Russia following Witta's economic reforms and its effects on material culture. So you may recognize Maggi as the brand name of the bouillon and seasonings company, which is still active today, having been founded by the eponymous Swiss inventor Julius Maggi in 1886. The company's logo is a four-pointed star, which accounts for the constellation, the Созвездие, that we find in the poem. And so here we've got some images of Maggie's branding with the star on display from both the turn of the 20th century in France and also from modern day America. This image on the right I actually got from Walmart. So do with that what you will. So the Maggie brand, which appears right at the midpoint of the middle stanza, enters deep into the poetic structure of Wywyskom. The star logo, now made to whirl joyously, becomes one of Mayakovsky's signature images. The Maggie name, which is clearly foreign and grammatically indeclinable in Russian, enters into an end rhyme with the equally foreign, though linguistically and etymologically different word sarkophagi. The brand, then, is not just part of this lyric poem's context or even content, but actually helps to generate its form. And the Maggie sarkophagi rhyme is particularly interesting if we remember the similar moment that we just saw in the Tragedia, rhyming the French robe et mode with the word commode. And commode is also, of course, borrowed from French, but unlike robe et mode, it's a commonly used Russian word written in the poem in Cyrillic rather than Latin alphabet. So the orientation of Wywyskom toward the images used in branding was not limited to this offhand reference to the Maggie star logo. When the poem was first published in 1913 in the futurist collection Srednik Traich, it was accompanied by two illustrations. One of these was drawn by Vladimir Tatlin and the other by Mayakovsky himself, and you can see them here. So Tatlin, you can tell which of them gained his fame as a visual artist, perhaps, but it's not my place to pass judgment. Tatlin's illustration, though more mimetically realistic than Mayakovsky's, is thematic and associative in how it represents the poem, presenting us with a fish, perhaps a kapchony sik, cutlery, and, of course, a Maggie cube. Mayakovsky's drawing is more difficult to process, but shapes can, I think, be discerned from within its chaos of lines. You can see possible representations of a fish, a turnip, a pretzel, and maybe other things as well. But most striking in the Mayakovsky drawing is the poet's name, scrawled in large letters in the top left corner, Ver Mayakovsky. And it kind of trails off toward the end, but it's clearly his name, right? In the context of the poem, this suggests that Mayakovsky's name serves the same function as Julius Maggie's. It's a brand. Indeed, when the two images are viewed together, Mayakovsky's floating name in his own illustration is reminiscent not of Tatlin's more, modest and conventional signature in the bottom left corner of his drawing, but instead it looks to me more like the Maggie logo in the bottom right of Tatlin's image. And by the way, you may have been able to discern that Tatlin misspells Maggie. So the brand name has two letter G's, two G's, rather than just one, right? But Tatlin's misspelling suggests a more famous meaning of Maggie as well. The three kings or three wise men of the Gospel of Matthew, the biblical Greek word is magoi, who come to the manger of the newborn baby Jesus bearing gifts. Now, one suspects that the pun between the name of Julius Maggie, the founder of the company, and the biblical Maggie was the main reason for the choice of a star as a logo, right? Referring to the Star of Bethlehem that guides the three wise men to the stable. So Tatlin's misspelling may not be merely fortuitous. Through its connection to biblical myth, it emphasizes the magical and transfigurative properties associated with branding in modern commodity culture. And if we then transfer this insight to Mayakovsky's illustration and the brand-like prominence of his name, we can see Mayakovsky, by analogy, as himself drawing upon the mythic and incantatory qualities of advertising and branding. So I've been offering a reading of Wywyskom as a celebratory lyric, motivated by excitement and affection for the poetic power of the brand name. But I don't want to overlook the fact that traces of Chlebnikov's dark vision of the industrial capitalist present do still remain in Mayakovsky's poem. So the funeral bureau and its sarkophagi, of course, intrude death into commodity culture, and the final stanza suggests the presence of a male subject who is far from happy with the brand of culture that surrounds him. He's chmury placiegen, right? And moreover, this subject is not only unnamed, but never even identified with a personal pronoun, to the point that it kind of trips me up every time I reread this poem and get to the third stanza. We infer the on solely from the logic of the sentence and the masculine adjective endings. Now, this effacement of the human individual again demonstrates an ongoing link with Cherniko's view in Juravi of modern material culture as displacing or annihilating human subjects. But this brings me to the issue of the most important human subject of all for Mayakovsky, namely Mayakovsky. So within the poet's oeuvre, Weaverskian is striking for its absence of explicit references to the first person. There is no real mention of a ya. However, Mayakovsky's lyric energy pervades the poem, and his command to us to read the iron books of street signs, right, starting with Читайте железные книги, transfers the labor of the lyric and apostrophic animation of the world onto the reader. So there is another well-known pre-revolutionary poem by Mayakovsky that evinces a similar fascination with branding, namely the sprawling Oblak of Steinach, which repeats the device we have already seen with Robe des Modes and Maggie by using a foreign brand name as an end rhyme. Here, though, the effect is far more shocking. Хорошо, когда в желтую кофту душа от осмотров укутана. Хорошо, когда брошенный в зубы эшафоту крикнуть «Пейте какао Вангутина». И эту секунду, бенгальскую, громкую, я ни на что времени. Янина. There should be a yeah there that I think is missing. So the scaffold here, the échafaud, is not mere futurist hyperbole. Mayakovsky is referring to a genuine anecdote, possibly true, I think more likely just an urban legend. The Soviet editors of Mayakovsky's PSS treat it as if it were true, but they don't provide any kind of support for this, and I'm inclined to take it with a grain of salt. But it certainly was an actively circulating urban legend at the very least. So the Dutch cocoa company Van Houten, founded by the chemist and chocolate pioneer Conrad Johannes van Houten, was in the process of international expansion at the turn of the 20th century and was one of the international firms penetrating Russian markets during the final years of the Romanovs' rule. And you can see a kind of Russian advertisement from the 1910s, a real one, for Van Houten's cocoa here. Obviously, the scaffold is not part of the original image. That's just me. So it was rumored that the company had convinced a condemned Russian criminal to cry out "Пейте какао Вангутина" as his last words in exchange for money that would be paid for the doomed man's family. Now, from a militant Bolshevik perspective, it would really be hard to imagine a juicier anecdote than this in 1915, right? The Van Houten story sensationally links the violent capital punishment of Tsarist autocracy with the influence and economic interests of European corporations. And Mayakovsky's politics was certainly in place by this time. He had already spent a year in prison for activity with the Bolsheviks. So this makes it all the more striking that Mayakovsky actually seems to welcome the soon-to-be dead man's final cry, equating it with his own bohemian provocations, like wearing his famous yellow blouse, his zoltaya kofta. There is no trace here of a Victor Hugo or Dostoevsky style painful fascination with the psychological state of a condemned man in the last seconds of his life. Instead, Mayakovsky defiantly embraces this moment. Excuse me, I have to turn on the lights again. Thank you. Okay. I think we can gain further insight, though, from the following stanza, where Mayakovsky insists that he would not trade this moment, devoting one's final words to a brand name, for anything. Now, the verb wymieniać can refer to various kinds of exchange, but in this context, I think the most important sense is that of marketplace trade. The word's proximity to the Van Houten line indicates that Mayakovsky's attraction to branding is paradoxically intended to remove the branded object from the sphere of commerce. Mayakovsky finds himself in the curious position of an anti-capitalist and anti-bourgeois poet of the commodity. By severing the brand name from its commercial and profit-generating function, he seeks to turn the brand from an economic instrument into a site of pure poetics, the naming of a thing for its own sake. From this overview of Mayakovsky's pre-revolutionary work, we can see that the Vastanye Vishe, which for Khlyebnikov betokened the total domination of humanity by its own alienated handiwork, is linked for Mayakovsky with his own subjective and aesthetic rebellion against urban alienation. What makes this shift possible is Mayakovsky's interest in things as naming and otherwise discursively representing themselves, an interest which shifts his focus from the industrial infrastructure that rebelled in Chernyakov's Juravi to the semiotics of consumer products. For Mayakovsky, branding and advertisements, new enough to be productively defamiliarizing, are poetically promising means by which things might indeed cast off the tatters of their worn-out names. But accomplishing this modernist revolt requires liberating commercial products and their brand names from commerce itself, finding a way to somehow turn the brand against the market. Mayakovsky hopes to avoid the subjugation of humanity to its products as envisioned by Chernykov by turning his own poetry into a medium through which objects can speak for themselves, with the modern object and the futurist poet acting in tandem. Now, needless to say, Mayakovsky's creative engagement with the status of things had to change dramatically with the transformed political and economic circumstances of the Civil War. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into much detail now about his two major Civil War texts, the satirical play Mysteria Booth and the Bolshevik epic 150 Millionov. I've been speaking long enough already. I have written about them, though, and I'd be delighted to talk about either of them in the discussion if anyone is interested. I will say that in both Mysteria Booth and in 150 Millionov, Mayakovsky remains fascinated by things and their rebellious potential, but he moves decisively away from brand names, which is only to be expected under war communism. However, as a postscript, there is one feature of 150 Millionov that I'd like to briefly discuss. So, Mayakovsky first published and distributed this poem without attaching his own name to it, and the poem's opening lines indicate an aspiration to channel the voice of a revolutionary collective. 150 миллионов матера этой поэмы имя. Пуля, рифма, огонь из здания. 150 миллионов говорит губами моими. Ротационная шагов в булыжном верже площадей напечатано это издание. On one hand, Mayakovsky's desire to downplay his own individual self and to join with the masses seems to have been genuine. Yet, as we know, the primary structuring principle of Mayakovsky's entire poetic corpus was his own enormous personality. It is hard to think of a contemporary poet as obsessed with his own persona as Mayakovsky. In the eyes of most orthodox Bolshevik critics, the intensity with which Mayakovsky poetically inhabited his individual self was his fatal flaw, forever marking him as suspiciously bourgeois. Mayakovsky's gesture towards anonymity at the start of 150 Millionov was clearly an attempt to resolve this precise issue and to establish his credentials as a genuine voice of the proletarian masses rather than merely his flamboyant individual self. Unfortunately, no one who actually read 150 Millionov was in any doubt about the identity of the poem's author. Leon Trotsky, for one, found Mayakovsky's depiction of the revolution to be fundamentally narcissistic, a mere outward projection of his own psychology. So, in Trotsky's words, just as the ancient Greek was an anthropomorphist and naively thought of the forces of nature as resembling himself, so our poet is a Mayakomorphist and fills the squares, the streets, and the fields of the revolution with his own personality. As the worst trials of the Civil War receded and NEP began, a pseudonymous review, and we don't actually know the real identity of the author. I've read speculation that it might have been Karl Radek, which would have been fascinating, but I can't confirm. So this review in Krasnaya Nosh, right, newly founded thick journal, expressed a similar complaint to Trotsky's, but in the review, this is worded in terms of commodity culture and advertising. So the reviewer, who used the pseudonym Anchar, wrote the following. 150 миллионов говорит губами моими. Поэтому Владимир Маяковский не напечатал на книге своего имени. Так начинает свою книгу Владимир Маяковский. Мы начнем с того, что мы в этом глубоко сомневаемся. Вся Россия курит только папиросы ада. Так читали мы на широких вывесках реклам. 150 миллионов говорит моими устами, тоже реклама. Though the rest of this review is unremarkable, in these lines I think Anchar makes a key insight, and one with which the poet himself may even have agreed, namely that there was a continuity between Mayakovsky's agitational political poetry after 1917 and the attraction to brand names which marked his pre-revolutionary work. The onset of NEP was, of course, a promising moment for Mayakovsky's attractions to revolutionary politics and the poetics of branding to combine. NEP's purpose was to rebuild the Soviet economy, shattered by the grueling years of war, through the limited re-establishment of the private sector under the political supervision of the Communist Party. NEP thereby introduced the new problem of how the Bolsheviks could tolerate and even encourage private markets while making sure that they served the long-term interests of socialism, making capitalist enterprise, as Lenin put it, socialism's temporary accomplice. While the NEP men themselves, flaunting their opulent lifestyles, were widely reviled, the commodities that they consumed and from which they profited were of vital importance. So in this environment, and maybe only this environment, Mayakovsky's paradoxically anti-bourgeois fascination with branding could serve a politically valuable purpose in helping to reconstruct the Soviet economy. Consequently, far from attempting to distance himself from the poetics of advertising as he had during the Civil War, Mayakovsky now embraced them more explicitly than ever before. So in a short 1923 article named Agitatia и реклама, written for the Ekaterinburg journal Tavarish Studenti, the poet described the wonders of European, especially German, advertising and urged his Soviet readers not to surrender the techniques of marketing to foreign capital. He wrote, «Мы не должны оставить это орудие, эту агитацию торговли в руках не патша, в руках буржуя-иностранца. В СССР все должно работать на пролетарское благо. Думайте о рекламе». For my purposes, though, and in terms of his earlier figurations of the Восстание вещей, the most striking section of Mayakovsky's article is the basic definition of advertising that he offers. He says, «Реклама – это имя вещи. Как хороший художник создает себе имя, так создает себе имя и вещь». This is a crucial statement for two reasons. Firstly, it indicates that the poet understood the practice of advertising in artistic terms, and more specifically, in terms of his own poetry. Practically no Russian writer spent as much time creating a name for himself as Mayakovsky, as we have seen with his self-titled Tragedia and with his enormous signature in the illustration to Вывескам. Secondly, however, this appeal to creating one's own artistic persona is followed by a curious withdrawal of the poet advertiser's direct role in constructing the name of the product. Supposedly, the product, the viesh, creates the name for itself, right? As in Вывескам and 150 миллионов, the moment when Mayakovsky's creative agency in naming or otherwise representing things should be clearest is the point at which he tries to diminish his own role and present things as autonomously creative or self-naming. So the model for this good artist, right, who creates a name for himself is clearly Mayakovsky, but his definition of advertising conceals his own persona from view and tries to assert that the things he advertises are the authors of their own names. Mayakovsky was soon able to put this spirit into practice when he and Alexander Rodchenko co-founded a two-man advertising agency, Reklam Konstruktor, whose primary clients were state-owned agencies like Masilprom, the Moscow Administration for Rural Cooperatives. Now, this is by no means an obscure chapter in Mayakovsky's career, right? It's widely known that he spent the first years of NEP devising jingles for products sold at Masilprom, usually ending with the slogan, «Нигде кроме, как в Masilpromie». But what has not, I think, been fully appreciated is just how much this turn towards advertising consummates an ongoing artistic investigation into the poetic powers of brand names that had occupied Mayakovsky ever since he first entered the public eye. The intersection of Mayakovsky's advertising work with the reception of his earlier poetry can be seen especially clearly with an ad for cigarettes that seems to directly, even tauntingly, respond to Anchar's criticisms of 150 миллионов. And we have it here. Нами оставляется от старого мира только папиросы и ира. And then, of course, нигде кроме как в Masilpromie. So, Anchar's review derisively offered a formula for pre-revolutionary advertising as «Вся Россия курит только папиросы ада». Mayakovsky simply changes the name to Ira. Yet the syntax of the first half of the ad shows traces of an ongoing struggle with the question of poetic subjectivity and its relationship to the naming of objects. I'm particularly struck by the rather awkward construction «Nani оставляются», which both preserves a human мы and also attempts to marginalize this мы by turning it into a passive voice instrumental «nani». Still, the eye is drawn most of all to the two brand names. Ira, of course, and Masilprom. So my final suggestion, and perhaps a controversial one, is that Mayakovsky was most able to fulfill his ongoing project of redeeming the Vastanye Vyshe when he turned away from conventional poetry entirely and tried his hand as an advertiser. After all, the most successful brands are the ones whose names become synonymous with their products, replacing our conventional words for the things we designate, taking a common noun and replacing it with a proper noun. Instead of tissues, we reach for a Kleenex. Instead of searching for something on the internet, we Google it. Perhaps the greatest attraction of brand names for Mayakovsky, then, is their potential to succeed at an old futurist goal and become Samavitya Slava, words and names that are not disconnected from things, but which surpass them. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Dominic. That was absolutely wonderful and very, very exciting. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so sorry we're not in the same room, so we could applaud. Thank you so much. Are there any questions already in the on Zoom? I have a few questions and comments, of course, but maybe the students would like to say something. Yes, or colleagues. Rodolphe, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
Yes, lovely. Thank you, Dominic. That was a wonderful talk. I'm afraid I'm sitting on a train right now, and my connection is slightly unstable, and I don't want to be a nuisance to other passengers, so I'm trying to keep it short. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. When you talked about the independent life of things, it made me remember of the movie Человек на аппаратом by Dziga Vertov, in which the first scenes show the independent life of things when people are asleep. And I was wondering whether you could elaborate on the difference between what you said about the life of things and the different regimes of anxiety and fear that they created among the poets before the revolution, and the way that the independent life of things is represented in the 1920s, in the time of the NEP, when obviously after the revolution, things have become much more submissive and calm, as we can see in Vertov's movie. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, and thank you for the question. And thanks also for joining while on a train, and I hope that it doesn't become part of any kind of ominous mechanical birds. So this is an excellent question, and I want to answer it in a couple of different ways, or at least attempt to. So something that I have constantly asked myself since beginning work on this project is, why just literature? There is so much to work with in other media, not least of which, of course, is film, and Vertov is very apropos, I think, in this discussion. But it seems to me that attention to the problems of the problems and also the possibilities afforded by Vichy and how they're transformed under a kind of Soviet version of modernity, right, are much more thought about typically when it comes to film on the one hand and certain of the visual arts on the other, especially I think the plastic arts, maybe also architecture, because all of these are media with a very clear kind of tangible or technological basis, right? I mean, to some extent, film as the distinctively modern medium speaks for itself, especially in the 20s. It's all about things because it's quite literally all about the camera and the film, right? I mean, the Kuleshov effect, we have the Kuleshov effect because it was so hard to get reels of film during the Civil War, and so new strategies had to be devised for how to tell stories when you only have a few shots to work with. So the whole history, I think, of the development of Soviet film is much more, well, either I don't, maybe it's not inherently much more intimately bound up with material questions. Maybe we're just much more used to thinking about it in that way. But I think we have kind of come to a greater understanding when film is concerned than we have with, say, literature. But specifically in the case of Vertov, right? Besides the ideological, the sort of different ideological frames, I think so much about the things moving around when people are asleep with Vertov has to do with the titular kinoapparat, right? He's shooting all of these things, but I think the one thing that really trumps all of them is the actual movie camera. And that device seems to be sort of laid bare a bit at the very end of the movie when the camera starts dancing and sort of unfolding itself, right? But it's a film that takes pains to show you that these effects are possible, that they can give you some kind of knowledge that you wouldn't otherwise have, but also that the reason they're possible is because of what the technology of the camera and of film specifically can do, and that we would otherwise be totally unable to produce, to think about, to see, or any of it. So yeah, when it comes to objects, Vertov is sort of paradoxically to me both someone with very wide-ranging attention and interests to the sort of world of Yeshi, and someone also with very narrow vision in that he approaches it all totally through the camera, and that's that's something that enables him rather than disabling him. But yeah, so far as Vertov specifically is concerned, that is what strikes me. I will say that since I didn't really say much about Mysteria Bouffe during the talk, that is one of the first points where you can see a real kind of concerted attempt to shift the emotions and the affect of the Восстание вещей in a kind of comforting direction rather than a threatening one. So you have these 14 nechistych, right? This kind of proletarian merry band that goes through its sort of travestied version of Noah's Ark, and then wanders through a kind of hell and a kind of purgatory and a kind of heaven, and has no time for any of it because it's all too Christian. But then finally arrives at the promised land, and the promised land turns out to be just a city that looks. I think I actually can't recall. I think it's Moscow, but it is a city that it seems so normal that they're surprised that it could have been the final destination. But then it's a post-revolutionary city, right? And so the various things come out to greet them. So here you still have self-moving objects, but well, I suppose they're still part of the Vastanya, but they're on the same side as the proletarians in the Vastanya, right? Or not really Vastanya Vichy because it's post-revolutionary things. So they come out and basically offer themselves to the sort of victorious 14 workers, right? Saying, they apologize for having played a role in oppressing them for so long, saying that it was because they were forced to by their owners. And so the proletarians and the things reach a sort of modus vivendi. One of them says, let's just strike a deal. We'll make you, right? We proletarians will make you things, and you'll feed us. And the things here in the script of the play, they're very pointedly not given brand names. So you have, things that talk, but it's just вещи with dialogue, or машины, or еды, right? Much more deliberately, I think, generic. This, Mysteria Bouffe was not particularly well received. I think part of the reason is that by the time, well, there's a lot of reasons, but specifically with this scene, these things had to be played by actors in costumes, right? So unlike the poems where you're just reading poems, or indeed unlike Человек с киноаппаратом, this is being produced on stage, and so you have things with dialogue, and so this is obviously an actor in a suit of some kind. And by the time Mysteria Bouffe was being put on, the famines were sweeping provincial Russia in the kind of final 1920, 1921, right? The end of the Civil War. Cases of cannibalism were known. And so I can't help but think that it was a bit, in ways that Mayakovsky did not foresee when he wrote it in 1918, it kind of struck a bit close to home, to have these, actors who are actually people in dressed up like foodstuffs, telling other human characters on stage, right, to eat them. Um, so I think I've ventured rather far afield, maybe, of the original question, but I hope it answers it to some degree.
Thank you so much, Dominic. I think I think Rodolphe had a problem with his connection just a few seconds ago, but fortunately you had finished answering by then. So great. Thank you so much. Guilhem also has a question, please. Guilhem?
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting for me. And I was wondering if a text like the beginning of Zavist, Alyosha, would be some kind of continuation of this topos that you described us, with this idea that Vichy его любят. What occurred to me when I thought about this text was that actually the things are not on the side of the proletarian in Zavist. They are rather on the side of Shogalstvo. And I found it very strange, actually. Thank you once again.
It's a pleasure, yeah. And Zavist is a book that I love to talk about. I have a chapter of the book manuscript that is more or less entirely about it, and it's natural, I think, to go there, from here, right, from the Восстание Вещей. That opening passage where Kavalierov is complaining that, things don't like him, but they do like Babichev. It's curious in a few ways, and one of the things that makes it unlike the futurist poems, I think, is that we are so thoroughly invited to see this as just, Cavaliero's particular way of viewing the world, right? He's relativized within the world of the novel. His gaze is not all we get. And you can regard that as a kind of neurosis if you're feeling uncharitable, or as a kind of artistic gift if you're feeling sympathetic to him. To my mind, I think that there's a way that you can interpret the kind of trademark Alyosha metaphor, right? These incredible metaphors and images that are the sort of lifeblood of Alyosha's prose style. I think you can interpret it in terms of the commodity form, when it comes to taking things, approaching them clearly not in a utilitarian way. And if there's one thing we know about Kavalierov and most of Alyosha's protagonists, it's that they are hopeless when it comes to the practical world, right? They can't do anything sort of functional, but they can see things in this amazing way and describe them in this amazing way. So it seems to me that the principle of exchange, right, that is part of what makes commodities commodities, the fact that you can take one and make it equivalent to another, no matter how different the two things are. So, so long as they're part of a commodity economy, I can take a pencil and a night at the opera and figure out how many pencils the night at the opera is worth, and vice versa, right? And you can do that with any two things. I think Kavalierov is doing something like that with his metaphors, right? They're always very visual. They're always very external. They lack any kind of, they're not these deep philosophical metaphors that you sometimes find in other writers that are trying to get at a profound truth about the essence of things. They sort of revel in the fact that they're very transitory and fleeting, and they're about a momentary appearance of two things as like one another. And that is exactly how this marketplace exchange works, right? Like pencils and a night at the opera, there's nothing that inherently connects them. But if I want to trade one for the other, or if I want to express the price of one in terms of the price of the other, then in that moment, they become equivalent. And what you say about the proletariat is also, I think, very true. Something that really strikes me about Zavist is that none of the characters really stably represent classes, right? The kind of bureaucrat, the bureaucrat Babichev is from some kind of former aristocratic family, right? As was Lenin, but not to get into that. Cavalierov is, I don't know, déclassé, some kind of intelligent, Mishanin or whatever, but these are just terms you use to describe people who lack a clear class pedigree of either the positive or the negative kind. And the sort of new Soviet people, right, like Volodya Makarov or whoever, also not really described as very proletarian. Very disciplined, very machine-like, but not very proletarian. So I think there's something interesting going on with the general lack of class coding in Zavist. Not just that things aren't on the side of the proletariat, but that it's really quite hard to find the proletariat or the bourgeoisie or any of the middle strata in that novel.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions? Maybe from the students? I don't see anyone else. Well then, okay. Then I will get into mine because I have a few. And thank you again, Dominic. It was absolutely wonderful. It was very interesting, and the fact that you allowed yourself to talk extensively and about Chlebnikov and about Mayakovsky, it was really great because we saw this. Maybe not this transition, but yes, these two points of view on things, on the revolt of things. And my first comment / question will be on Chlebnikov, on Zhuravl. So I really loved how you linked Zhuravl to the St. Petersburg text of Russian literature. I completely agree with you, and I loved all your very fine comments you made on Vastanya, for example, and Vastal and the Medny Vsadnik, etc. And so this daunting image of this industrial city that that dwells over the human beings, and I was actually a bit surprised that you didn't mention something that struck me as I don't know, maybe not evident, but that it came to mind when I read this poem. I didn't know the poem beforehand, but what do you think of this? Well, when Chlebnikov describes this crane as being made of human flesh and all this восстание мертвых, восстание тел, so we're in 1909. And this is the time where Fedorov's ideas, Nikolai Fedorov's ideas, are very, very present in the Russian intellectual scene, on the Russian intellectual scene. His philosophy of the common task has been published in 1906. And so this idea that our ancestors will rise from the graves and we will all be together and we will create a new world in which the dead ones will not be dead anymore, because we will have found a new way of transforming the dead substance into a new substance, into a live substance. This is, you know it very well. This is what Platonov will reuse much later in the 30s. But here, what is striking is that Chlebnikov, we know that Chlebnikov was influenced, as many of his contemporaries, by Fedorov's ideas, and that this idea of this common resurrection is present in his other texts. But here, it's like it is present, but in a very negative turn. It's in a very negative way. So as if this common task will not work, as if the dead flesh will still be dead, because it will be incarnated or reincarnated in something that is by definition dead, because industrial. So I would like to have your thoughts on this, because I think that it really transcends the poem, this idea of восстание мертвых, so and the flesh, and the idea of flesh. So this seems very interesting. And of course, it's not the only poem of the decade to be dedicated to the city and to the city modernity, in which something demonic is happening. So I'm thinking, for example, of Brюсов's Конь Блед, which is a little bit earlier. But this is also a common trope in this early modernist poems. But here, I think it's weird actually how this optimistic idea of the common task is being turned into something horrible. So this was my first remark. I have another one. I have another one on Mayakovsky, two actually on Mayakovsky. So in Tragedia, in the 1913 text, I really was. I'm completely agree with you with everything you said, and I found it very, very interesting. And so, as you have shown, Mayakovsky has is using not really things, but things that are themselves represented on signs. So they are not really material things; they are signs. And this is how, as you have marvelously showed, Mayakovsky's own name will become a sign also, and the publicity expression. So, well, but what is interesting, but maybe you talk about it in your book, but I think it's interesting to know that the characters that are saying those things, especially the one that is saying «штаны сбежали у портного, и корсет слезал с вывески» и так далее, корсеты слезали с вывесок, he's a handicapped man, so he doesn't have neither an eye nor a leg, человек без глаза и ноги. So he himself is defined through a material viewpoint. So a material viewpoint on flesh. So his body, his imperfect body, his incomplete body, not only imperfect, it's incomplete, is the one that tells the reader about the revolt of things. So this is something I would love you to comment on also. And then I had also a comment and a question on what you said about the illustrations of Tragedia. This is Tragedia, yes? No, this is not Tragedia. This is Vivescum. The illustrations by Tatlin and by Mayakovsky. So it's wonderful how, yes, you have said it. It's absolutely striking how Mayakovsky's name appears as a brand, whereas in Tatlin's illustration, Magi appears as a brand. But I don't know whether you comment on this more in your book, but Magi in Russian doesn't really, I don't know if the others will agree with me, doesn't really firsthand makes us think of the roi mage, so the kings who came to visit Christ after his birth, because the name of roi mage, of the kings in Russian is Volkhvy. But still, it doesn't change the fact that Magi sounds like something magical, sounds like mag, he's a volshebnik, mag, and this is maybe even, so I think your idea of the star is great, but I think maybe this is even more powerful, because it links the idea, it puts light, let's say it like this, on the idea that is very common after all, but here very powerful, that the poet is like a mag, like a kudesnik, like someone, like a wizard. So mag is a wizard. So this is fun, and a wizard in plural, because maybe Tatlin wants to underline also with this pun. I don't know if the pun was intended or not, that Mayakovsky is not the only wizard in this idea, in this scheme, because Mayakovsky is the poet, yes, he is the wizard of words, but Tatlin is the wizard of the visual representation. And what I loved about those two drawings is that Tatlin represents. So yes, he writes Maggie on the little cube, but he represents. And so we don't need an inscription to know that this is a fish that is represented. Whereas Mayakovsky on the drawing you showed, he writes riba. So it's like, I don't know, it made me think, of conceptual art, where you write something on something that doesn't resemble at all the thing that is written, the name. But the naming of the thing gives this thing a reality. So I can take a bottle and I will write on it bottle, or and this also resembles, of course, which has now become a very common marketing practice, where you sell bottles on which you write bottle. So it's fun, and it goes with what you said at the end, how we say, instead of saying we reach for a tissue, we reach for a Kleenex, and one can go even further and say, instead of reading a poem written by Vladimir Mayakovsky, we read a Vladimir Mayakovsky. So Vladimir Mayakovsky becomes himself a brand name. So yes, I think it was the last of it. I'm sorry for the very long talk on my part. Yes, I think that's all. Thank you. Thank you in advance.
Thank you. That's an extremely stimulating and helpful set of comments, and I was taking notes to the best of my ability, and I'll try to respond to it comprehensively, but we'll see if I succeed. Yeah, so I mean, well, let me sort of go backwards. Yeah, the point about Maggie versus Valfrey is that is an extremely good point, and it's possible that I may somewhat be blurring the lines between what Tatlin or Mayakovsky would have been thinking and what I strongly suspect Maggie himself and his fellow executives were thinking. And when it comes to Maggie, right, they were all good Swiss Christians. I'm sure that the choice of the star was kind of not coincidental, but yeah, it is, I think, probably more constructive to think of it in terms of Mark than in terms of Wolf. Yeah, because this is not a specifically Christian or biblical engagement, at least not from Mayakovsky and Tatlin's perspective, but it very clearly is a magical one. I love the idea that the plural Magi there is Tatlin kind of making sure that he doesn't get underrated or forgotten, putting himself equal with Mayakovsky. I think that's wonderful. And so far as this question of representation in the drawings versus the labels goes, one kind of delightful thing that I've come across is the kind of closeness, the closest of the futurists in that circle with Cubism and their interests is well known, right? Cuba Futurista, and so on and so on. And so when you look at Western Cubist painters, like, Picasso has one, Mondrian also, there are paintings you can find where they make a point of including bouillon cubes because it's a way of challenging themselves. How do you represent a cube when you're a cubist, right? How do you find a cubist way of conveying a cube so that it doesn't just disappear into everything else that you're painting? So yeah, Tatlin is, engaging in a kind of transnational or trans-European avant-garde contest there. So as the tragedia goes, the sort of handicaps of not just that one character, right? But kind of all of the characters who are not named Vladimir Mayakovsky is incredibly striking. And there's, surely truth to the kind of view that it's a sort of corporeal manifestation of modernist fragmentation, right? Like fragmentation is what modernism is all about. And so in this case, it's human bodies that are fragmented, except apparently for Mayakovsky's himself, but then by the end, he's promising to leave tattered bits of his soul all over the road and the city as he goes out. So he too seems to be aspiring toward some kind of mutilation. But something about, and I can't remember exactly what it was you said, but something about the way you were discussing this brought up lack as an important issue, right? Absence. That, someone who's kind of thinking of being handicapped in terms of, there being a kind of constitutive absence to your bodily experience. And that to me is exactly what is so striking about Mayakovsky's engagement with brands, and especially in the Tragedia, with the form that the Vastanya takes, being that the objects kind of throw away their old names and try to find new ones, right? Because it really kind of complicates any attempt to think about what he's doing just in terms of how like the poetic signs relate to the objects that they're supposed to refer to. Because even within the poem itself, right, within the kind of fictional world it creates, the objects are already aware of this problem, and they're engaged in a kind of semiotic quest of their own. Incidentally, something I didn't really talk much about this, but well, this whole idea of things trying to find their own name, right? I think it's, and also speaking of parts of the body, may also be productive to think of it in terms of voice, especially because that has some etymological basis in Russian, right? And the futurist Khlebnikov especially were these kind of obsessives over the sort of deep dark pits of Slavic etymology, right? And so thanks to Heidegger and others, everyone knows that like the English thing or German Ding or whatnot come from these kind of ancient assemblies, and shows or cosa or whatnot all come from Latin causa, right, meaning a lawsuit. So again, it's something that is debated over or discussed. But the root, the Indo-European root, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce because you can't pronounce Proto-Indo-European, but the root from which the word viesh comes is the same as the English word voice, right? So, and this is why in other Slavic languages, like, in other Slavic languages, you have words for things, synonyms for Russian viesh, that really look, if you're a Russian speaker, like they should mean speech, right? Like in Ukrainian, it's svich, in Polish, it's rzecz. But there is this kind of etymological Slavic link between not things and an assembly, but instead things and voice, right? Like the adjective vieshi, right, for prophetic, comes from the same root. And speaking of Tatlin, Khlebnikov wrote a wonderful poem dedicated to Tatlin where he sort of plays with this. He has a couplet. It's "Так неслыханные вещи жестяные кистью вещи," right? So going from adjectival vieshi to the kind of noun vieshi that we've been talking about all this time. And so finally, I've been saving Fyodorov for last because he's certainly crossed my mind, right? When looking at this, and I don't quite know what to do with him. I mean, at least in the case of Juravi, and I think the way that you articulated your question sort of explains why. It's Juravi is such a strange poem. It's strange compared to its kind of symbolist contemporaries or predecessors. And by the way, it makes a lot of sense to mention Brusov and Kornblet. People like to speculate about to what extent Khlebnikov was borrowing from Kornblet, but he's also doing many things that are not remotely present in Brusov, right? But it also doesn't really look much like other Khlebnikov poems either. It's this really strange beast. Fyodorov, I mean, it's easy with Mayakovsky, right? Mayakovsky wants to be resurrected, and so he's invested in Fyodorov because he wants to be first in line. Khlebnikov is clearly interested in the common task as well, as you say, but yeah, when looking at Juravi, it hits me most of all as something that I would expect to find, but really don't. I think because there's no element of the soul, right? There's no element of individuality on the part of the dead bodies that become part of the bird. And generally, the sort of bizarre thing about Fyodorov is both how invested he is in the spirit and the soul in this kind of Christian way, but also how obsessively physical and material and scientific he is about it, and the idea that you get the soul back by, painstakingly putting together all of the constituent molecules of the dead person. And yeah, no trace of that at all in Juravi, because there's no sense, like these bodies are just bodies. It's just their flesh that seems to matter. So yeah, there's a kind of absolute immanence, I think, to the entire world of Juravi, which makes it impossible to engage with any notion or anything that resembles the retrieval of dead ancestors or dead people, right? The people themselves are hardly personified. They're just kind of, it's as if Yuji is just another substance to be thrown into the mix.
Thank you so much. Well, I agree with you with what you have just said about Fedorov. I still think that you cannot really omit talking about him when you read when you suggest a close reading of Juravel, because I mean, it seems maybe too easy and maybe too quick, but I think it's very difficult to to have a poem, to read a poem that talks about corpses and dead bodies rising from the soil, and not to mention Fedorov, if the poem in question was written between, I don't know, 1906 and in the beginning of the 1920s or even 1930s. So because Fedorov was so much everywhere and not necessarily well read and well, because in your response you have shown that you, for example, have read at least precisely part of his works, because I assume that nobody has read everything he has ever written, but I mean, that there's a part in his philosophy that concerns the soul, and there's a part that concerns the body, etc., etc. But I think that if you see how Fedorov's ideas, disseminated and were disseminated in this period, in this age, you come very soon to the conclusion that maybe even people didn't read him extensively, but this idea of rising of the flesh, this is the most striking. So this is what remains, even if all the other elements are not necessarily present. So this is I think you can't close read this poem and not talk about Fedorov, even if to say that it doesn't have anything to do with it, but you understand what I'm saying. And also, but this is very anachronical, but it made me think, because when you first started showing these excerpts with bodies and cemeteries, etc., I didn't think of those poor people that Peter the Great used to build St. Petersburg. But of course, your interpretation is very accurate. I thought of something else. I thought, well, when was this written? Because it made me think of all this also fascination with dead corpses, right in the aftermath of the revolution, when the Bolsheviks, wanted to abolish the traditional way of burying the corpses and the traditional ways of saying goodbye to the dead, etc., etc., and that when they have invented the crematoriums, which Mayakovsky has written about, if I'm not mistaken. So this also can be read as something that will be, I don't know, echoed 10 years later as this ominous image of the how do you say it, of the corpses burnt, and you know, this tuman and etc. So yeah, thank you very much, Dominic. Guilhem has also a question, please.
Yeah, it's not a question. I just wanted to add something, but I don't know what to do with it. Is when you're talking about Восстание Vichy, the first thing that occurs to mind is the speech and the article of Shklovsky about Воскрешение Vichy, who also has this very strong Fyodorovian text. But the thing is, that's where I don't know what to do about it, is for Shklovsky, what is dead is the word. The language is a graveyard, the language is full of corpses, of dead words and stuff. And what you have to resuscitate is the word itself and not the thing. And maybe when you said that actually there is a link between the thing and the voice, I heard something like a possible conjunction between those two approaches that were both in, I mean, Shklovsky was with the futurists at this time, so I think it would make sense. But yeah, I don't know, could you maybe elaborate a bit on this? It just occurred to me when Daria spoke about Fyodorov.
Yeah, I mean, right. So, okay, first of all, just before getting to Shklovsky again about Fyodorov, Daria, I think you're right. First, I mean, I think there does need to be some attention paid to Fyodorov here as kind of inescapable, such a sort of close and sort of unavoidable thinker when dealing with precisely this kind of stuff. I mean, maybe one avenue to sort of relocate Fyodorov in Juravi is, I think the thing that really differentiates Khlyebnikov's version of the Peterburgsky text from what you would find in, say, Bloch or, you know, a few years later in Bieli, right, in these symbolist approaches to it, is that for the symbolists, the threatening elements in Petersburg are elemental and they are chaotic, right? It's this kind of churning Dionysian miasma, and anything could happen. It could do anything whatsoever. Whereas when it comes to Khlyebnikov and Juravi, human beings may not know what the Juravi is going to do or the Vieshi, but the Vieshi do know, right? We have, you know, that insistence. They are following some kind of, what is the phrase? Starinные предначертания, right? They have laws, they have principles. And so there's a kind of insistent rationalism to Khlyebnikov's portrayal of this event, regardless of how sort of grotesque and weird and fantastic it is. I mean, Khlyebnikov always has this kind of curiously hyper-rationalist bent, right? You know, not to get into all of his laws of time and space and so on, but it's an ongoing concern for him. And it seems to me that Fyodorov does to a much greater degree than the symbolists as well, right? This is maybe something that Fyodorov shares with Khlyebnikov. The idea that, you know, the Общее дело, I mean, it's a mystical task, but it's also one that you can and must approach in a kind of rationally oriented way. So maybe that's a helpful connection. And yeah, so far as Shklovsky goes, so in the written version of this, Shklovsky pops up a few times. And yeah, so the thing that is kind of recurrently difficult about the early Shklovsky to me is precisely this tendency to sort of slip and slide back and forth between talking about Vieshi and talking about Slava, right? And even in Воскрешение Slova, I mean, yes, you're right that the emphasis is on reviving the words, but within that speech, or I think it was originally a speech, Brodiachая собака, but within that text even, right? Even then, at some point, he stops saying воскресить слова or воскресить слово and starts saying надо воскресить вещи. And, you know, no one ever accused Shklovsky of being a highly consistent thinker, right? But this one is particularly hard to deal with. And so this isn't exactly an answer, but just a sort of footnote. We do know that Shklovsky was incredibly excited by especially Mayakovsky's version of the Восстание вещей, right? Which makes perfect sense. I mean, you know, casting off the лохмотья изношенных имен, I mean, it's, you know, basically just like it's setting the stage perfectly for Остранение. And in one of those articles from the Civil War that then went on to become a chapter in Theory of Prose, I think it's Строение рассказа и романа, which, you know, why would you end up talking about Mayakovsky in an article about the Строение рассказа и романа, right? But he says, поэт снимает все вывески со своих старых мест, художник всегда зачинщик восстания вещей. So Shklovsky revises his formulations based on what he reads and what he likes in Mayakovsky as well. And my own perspective is, I think, I want to read even Mayakovsky's Восстание вещей in rather more limited terms than that, right? Not as a kind of blueprint for what all art should be, but, you know, I also I have different intellectual aims than Shklovsky did.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And I also wanted to add something about blog, but we will continue next time, dear Dominic, because we have run out of time. And our train has arrived as well. So bye.
My train has arrived, indeed. Thanks a lot.
Of course, thank you. Thank you for having me. This was such a pleasure.
Thank you so much again, and hope to see you soon in Paris. Bye.
Merci mille fois.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you so much.